Good evening, everyone. You're welcome to today's live session. We're supposed to talk about the problems that we encounter producing tomatoes, and then today I really want to focus on the current trends in Nigeria. I'll be looking at the problems and then sustainable solutions, because we just don't want to focus on the negative but also look at the bright side as well. Before now, the way tomato market has been, the way producing tomato has been, it's not so much the same as it is right now. So there are a few changes that we need to talk about, a few changes that needs to be noted, especially for farmers that are yet to venture into it, or farmers that are not current with what's obtainable. All right, so one of the first things that we have to talk about when it comes to tomato production is pests and diseases. When producing tomatoes, depending on the season, you are likely to battle with diseases like diseases that fall under the category of fungal disease and viral diseases, and some of these, even bacterial disease as well. Some of these diseases can be very fatal, can cost you your entire investment. When it comes to tomato production, except the seed has inbuilt resistance to some of these diseases, you are likely to encounter them. It's almost like a regular thing that happens. So what that means is, when producing, if you fail to choose a seed that is resistant to some of the diseases that are common to tomatoes, the likelihood of you falling into the issue of pest and disease when producing tomatoes is high, right? So and like I said, those tomato diseases, pests that affect tomatoes are not friendly. They are not friendly at all. They can be very fatal. So let me give an example. For instance, you have diseases like your bacterial wilt, you have your early blight, late blight, a number of them. When it comes to bacteria, you have your bacterial wilt and a couple of them. All these things I mentioned, once they hit your tomatoes, the likelihood of losing everything is high. Bacterial wilt, for instance, there's no cure. Once bacterial wilt hits your tomatoes, they dry up from the root up, right? And then bacterial wilt most times doesn't happen until it begins to bear fruits, right? So when you are close to enjoying the dividends of your labor, dividends of your hard work and all of that, that's when bacterial wilt comes in and it sweeps. But in fact, the highest you can do with bacterial wilt is to uproot affected plants and pray that it doesn't spread, especially when it's at the advanced stage. At the early stage, you can do a thing or two to contain the situation, but when it gets to an advanced stage, the best you can do is just to uproot the ones that are affected and hope it doesn't spread to the other plants. So this is how much harm can come the way of your tomatoes, right? So now the sustainable solution, because I'm saying this and it sounds so simple until you invest about $1 million or 500,000 or 200,000 in the production, and you wake up one morning and you see that your tomato plants are being affected by a disease or by pests, and then when you come back after 1 week, the whole farm is gone, right? That's when you could tell how serious something like this is. So to curtail problems like this, to overcome problems like this, you must ensure that you are using is tomato seed that has built-in resistances to the common diseases and pests that affects tomatoes. Now, what I'm talking about has nothing to do with GMOs. Naturally, you have plants that it's just like human genetics. You have people that don't suffer malaria because of their inbuilt immunity. You have people that have resistance for particular diseases, certain races, So even in your animals, you have animals that, for instance, you have what we call trypanosomiasis, right? You might have come across trypanosomiasis. It's a very serious disease in animals, but there are some animals, like in your cattle or your goats, there's what we call West African dwarf. Those breed have resistance to trypanosomiasis. So if you're looking for a cattle that when you bring to a place that is infested with trypanosomiasis, that will be able to survive, you're talking about West African dwarf, right? So the same thing with tomatoes too. You want to produce a variety that will not be affected by some of those common diseases. Then you have to make sure that you are selecting a seed that has already built-in immunity, that has resistance to such disease, right? Then for your pests, you have to ensure that you observe pest control measures, especially for tomatoes. Your organic or biological control measures can go a very long way, right? Can go a very long way. So, but if you notice, I didn't talk much about pests, because that of pests can be handled. But you see that of disease is, we're talking about problems today, right? So disease is like the real deal when it comes to, one of the real deals when it comes to production, when it comes to producing tomatoes. So to save yourself the stress, you have to ensure you choose a seed that doesn't have those problems. So, and in the same vein, we also there's a peculiar problem that happens when cultivating tomatoes. I think somebody was sharing a problem recently about how that she was planting tomatoes, and then she had planted it for like 3 years, the same variety, and then after a while she experienced what we call nematode crisis. So nematodes had grown in her soil over time, and so because of the reuse of that particular land to produce that same kind of tomatoes, nematodes had grown in the soil, so they were killing off her tomatoes. She lost all her, when you are farming, many a times you regurgite your capital, in the sense that you are putting in, probably you cultivated this year. My guy greets you. Well done, welcome. So there are some people, so after producing, they take the capital and put back. So this woman had been doing that for like 3 years, and then on the 3rd year she lost the whole money because nematodes had grown in her soil. So when you are growing tomatoes, especially in open field, you must over time rotate crops. You must endeavor to rotate crops so that soil-borne diseases and nematodes and the rest of them will not multiply fast in the soil, right? And if you have access to some of the inputs that are available there, you make sure that you are always applying nematicides. You have nematicides that can control nematodes, so you can actually produce over and over on that same soil, but then you are treating your soil before you start. So But if you don't have access to some of these inputs like the nematicides, you must ensure that you are rotating what you are producing on that soil. You must ensure that after a year or two, you switch to another crop, take the tomato somewhere else, right, on another portion of land and farm there. And then you could come back and just to ensure that the soil remains healthy. So this is another problem that people are facing, the inability of the soil to keep giving you the same kind of result for a long period of time. So that's where crop rotation comes into play. So these are like the problem that affect farmers that produce tomatoes. It's either is pests, diseases, or soil problem. And then also another very important thing that affects production of tomatoes is the cost of production. Cost of production versus market reality. This one, I have a first-hand experience of this one. You know, you spend a lot of money buying the seed, buying fertilizers, buying, you know, all the things you need to grow your crops. And then after producing, you now get to the market, and what you see there gets to throw you off balance. So that's one of the problems we have currently producing tomatoes. You know, sometimes, you know, there are seasons for the abundance of tomatoes. These days it's even very difficult to predict it. You could actually predict, okay, this is the time that I'm going to plant because tomato will be scarce then, and you'll be shocked that after you are done your prediction, you go to market and tomatoes everywhere. And then we have a problem with how our marketers behave when it comes to tomatoes, because even when there's abundance of tomatoes in the market, they still want to even when tomatoes is kind of scarce in the market, these market people, they still want to buy at a cheap rate. You get it's a challenge because you didn't buy, input is not going down. Fertilizer, I've not heard that fertilizer is going down. The last time I checked, I think last week or so, inputs are going up, price of seed is going up, price of fertilizer is going up, price of everything you need to produce is going up, right? But then you go to markets and then you discover that the price of things, the cost of the tomato itself is not high, right? So it's discouraging because you don't want to produce and not make money, right? Especially for farmers that are just starting out. You need to regain your capital, you need to make a little profit so that you can replant again. And this is worse for us in the south, southeast, southwest, south, because our government hardly gives us aid to farm. More like it's always difficult to get financial aid from governments in this part of the country. But people in the north, the experience there is a bit different because the government is always helping out with fertilizers, with seeds and all of that. So when they are coming to the market, they don't even mind because even if they don't make so much, they were aided, right? And that's a problem for us in the south because we don't get any aid. We use our money to farm and then you get to market. And so if you want to produce tomatoes, one of the most important things you do is to ensure that you produce it in a way that doesn't cost you much. So if there are some overhead costs that makes your cost of production go high, you have to ensure that it will be brought down so that you can make whatever you are making, your cost of production is not taking too much from it. This is the way to go about it. So if you want to produce tomato now, you have to produce with wisdom. You have to cut down your costs. Whatever way you can cut down costs, you cut down costs so that your return will be reasonable. And so so I've talked about fluctuation because let me just even talk about fluctuation because it's related to cost of production versus market reality. You see, when it comes to fluctuation, which is a market reality, the price of tomatoes is never stable. The price of tomatoes is these days is becoming difficult to predict. because initially during dry season, cost of tomatoes is high, so you can target to produce in dry season and make a few extra gain, right? But right now, like this year, there was tomato in January and February, if you can remember, because that was when we planted ours. And then ever since that time, the difference has not been so much. There were times when the price of tomatoes went up, there's a bit of scarcity and all of that. But I tell you, it's not like what it used to be. Before, we know during rainy season, that is when tomato is everywhere. But now, even dry season is not as scarce as it used to be. So for you to make profits from tomatoes production, you definitely must find a way to produce at a lower cost. And then if you can also keep predicting when it will be high, then you could make extra profit. So the market fluctuation, the price fluctuation is a major problem for us. And like I said, cutting costs of production is the way to go. So finally, one of the major problems that we have is post-harvest losses. I posted a picture of almost a trailer of tomatoes that got dumped on the road. Now, that very story, I've had some of my customers have had such experiences. So the shelf life of tomatoes is not very long. There are some tomatoes that after you harvest, within 10 days they are gone, right? So some people harvest when it's half ripe, or when it just starts ripening, so that you can have enough time to send the tomatoes far and increase the time for the tomato to get to the end user. So in that very picture, I think the vehicle that was conveying that tomato had issues, and so it was a waste, because before it would get to where it's supposed to get to, it would have turned to water. I have a customer that bought goods that was, I think, worth close to $1 million or so from the north. Most of our most of the food we eat is brought in from the north. So she brought in, I think, a bus full of veggies, cabbage, tomatoes, bell pepper, a couple of veggies, green beans and the likes of it. So I think the vehicle broke down for almost a week, and her goods didn't get to her. By the time it got to her, more than half of what she ordered for was spoiled, including the tomatoes. You get? So we have this because of the shelf life, the nature of tomatoes, the shelf life, the short shelf life it has. It spoils very quickly. And then, when you plant your tomatoes, it produces so well, it produces so much, because in fact, if it's not much, you can't even make money, right? Because one basket sometimes is 20,000, sometimes 15,000. You can imagine you need like maybe 10 baskets to be able to make 100,000 or something. So it produces a lot. And so because it produces a lot, and then it doesn't stay for long, within a short period of time, it's completely wasted. It's a problem. It's a major problem, right? It's a major problem. And then you could get to market and see competition, right? In fact, when tomato is in its peak, there's a lot of wastage, right? So, and now remember that you're using your money to farm this thing. It's your money that the shelf life is for a short period of time, right? So it's a huge problem for a lot of farmers. So how do we go about this? One of the most sustainable way or viable solutions to this very problem is processing. And there are two common ways you can process. Okay, so my network has been very shaky. So I was actually talking about post-harvest losses, and I made us understand that because of the shelf life of tomatoes and how much it produces in quantity. It's always a struggle to get everything out and get it all sold, right? So post-harvest losses when it comes to tomato is usually high, if not the highest. So in order to curtail the amount of waste involved, I said that instead of allowing it to get spoiled totally, we could decide to process into by drying or process it to paste. Right? Those are like the two common ways of processing tomatoes. And then you also have other ways of processing tomatoes into other valuable products like dry powdered tomatoes, right? Your dry tomatoes can be used during dry season when tomatoes is kind of scarce. But like I said earlier, that scarcity is not as it used to be again. So even in dry season, you have a couple of it around. But despite that, you still have, you could still sell during dry season, probably not as high as it used to be. Okay, so that's the way to process. But now, if we have options for processing, why are we still having post-harvest losses? Let me break it down. If you were to dry the tomatoes so that it can be sold during dry season or when tomato is scarce, there are some things you need to take note of. First of all, you have to involve another form of capital, because you need to involve labor that will help you cut the tomatoes into slices. And then if you're using an industrial dryer, that's another money. Even if you're using if you're drying it in the sun, that would involve a form of labor that will have to be paid, right? So the point here is, if you are drying, another cost is added to your previous cost of producing. How much are you going to sell during dry season? And I told us that currently in dry season, you still have tomatoes. It's not as scarce as it used to be during dry season. So now you've spent money to produce, you've spent money to buy fertilizer, you spend money to buy seed, you spend money on people to weed for you and all of that to produce. You weren't able to sell everything because it was about to get spoiled. And okay, say, okay, let's process, let's not allow it to waste. You're now bringing another money to process, to dry it, and then at the end of the day, you might not be able to make back the money for even producing it in the first place, not talk of the money for processing. So it would even be of no use to dry if you are not able to make back your money. So these are some people just don't prefer to allow it to spoil. It's better you count your loss and move on, right? And then these are the problems. I'm trying to point out what tomato farmers are going, some of the things that we've experienced, right? So another problem you would face in processing, if you want to process tomato into paste, it's not just that thing that you do where you just grind it, and you can't grind and package, right? There are processes that the tomato will have to go through before it can be sealed and resold or sold in the market. How many farmers can afford a processing machine? We're still going back to the problem of adding more costs, right? Before you can sell and make your money back. And so, in fact, this very one, if you check in Nigeria, a lot of people are running away from tomato processing. Let me tell you something. There are rumors that the tomatoes your paste tomatoes you eat is not really tomatoes. Just a fragment of it is tomatoes. You have things like cornstarch and color and all of that being added to it just to, for them to be able to make their money back. I don't know how true that is, but if that is the case, then it shows you that there's a big problem in making returns in processing. Probably the cost of the machines or the cost of the whole cost of processing or whatever, but it involves an extra cost. So will the farmer go and get a processing machine because he's already losing, right? He's already losing. So even if you want to process, it's not as easy as it sounds. So if you're unable to sell, the likelihood that you're losing your money is high. It's there. So So this is why when you are producing the sustainable solution, now probably the government can come in and create processing, because I think Dangote did that with his processing facility, where he was taking tomatoes from tomato farmers, so you don't have to have post-harvest losses to just bring to their factory. They buy from you and process it. So except we have, scenarios like that where we have existing tomatoes factories, that's people that are really using tomatoes to make their pastes, right? Except to have such facilities that open their doors to local farmers and tell them, okay, so bring what you have, let's process it, let's pay you for your produce. And so it's a win-win for both parties, both people that are processing and people that are farming that could not sell off, or that don't have large market entry or a strong market presence, right? So except to have things like that, or where you have government creating factories like that where farmers can easily come to trade, something like that happens with okay, let's not go off track, but there are some other products where you have processing factories call farmers, bring all you have, we are buying everything, and they pay you good. It's not like giving you peanuts, they pay you well for it, and then they process it. There are other products that are doing well, but tomatoes is not. Tomatoes is not. So it's something that has to be looked into, right? So, but as a farmer, the best you can do within your power, because this, as I said, is peradventure, there are occasions that gives you such opportunities, right? But within your power, make sure that if you are producing tomatoes, you are sure of your market. If you are not sure of your market, don't go into production of tomatoes. You can take the risk with other produce, not with tomatoes, because the point here is that the shelf life of tomatoes is short. So if you don't already have an existing market, you don't have a market waiting for your product, and in fact a market that is large enough to take off your whole produce, don't start. Instead, do something else. There are other products there are other crops that do very well, that is easy to produce, that will give you money. If you don't have, because market is a real deal, it's a big deal when it comes to tomatoes. Number two, you have to ensure that your market, when it comes to tomatoes, you have to ensure that your market is not far. Whenever you're producing tomatoes, you must ensure that your market is not far. If your market is far, you are creating room for the possibility of logistics problem. There are some times that my bell pepper stay on the road for like 2 days, but the quality of my bell pepper can stay for 14 days before it gets it begins to lose its quality. So if it stays on the road for 2 days, I have nothing to worry about. Not tomatoes. So you cannot afford the luxury of pushing your tomatoes far, especially when you have it in bulk. So you have to make sure that your market is close to you to reduce the possibility of post-harvest losses. So this is what you can do as a farmer to protect your investment, right, from post-harvest losses. Okay, but in other cases where you can find processing factories, you can get things like that, then you can actually make use of such alternatives or such options. But like I said, the best way to protect yourself is to have a market that is close to you, right? A market that is not far, so that you don't run into problems, and you make sure that you have the markets already before you start producing. So let me just take a little recap of what I've talked about today. So first of all, I started talking about pests and diseases as part of the things that affect production, and I told you that some diseases that are so disastrous, they can wipe your whole farm within weeks. In fact, some of them within days, the whole farm is gone. So if you want to produce, you have to ensure that you're getting seeds that are resistant to these common diseases. I told us there are a couple of them. And I did mention this, during rainy season, it's usually high. The possibility of those diseases affecting you is actually very high. So it's either you use organic ways or whatever way that you can use to control those pests and disease. And then we talked about cost of production and market realities. And we said getting your inputs for production is at a high rate, and there's no guarantee that the market would reward you with an amount that will cover for your cost of production and also give you profit, because there's huge fluctuation when it comes to the price of tomatoes. So you could spend a whole lot of money to produce. In fact, one of our productions, we could not even recover our capital. We couldn't recover capital. We just had to, sell the way the market was at that time, and just got as much money as we could. But we were not able to actually recover all the money back. Our capital. I'm not talking about profits. I'm not talking about salaries that was paid. Just the cost of input. So, and I said how to go about this is to ensure that you cut down costs by every way possible, so that worst come to worst, you have something to go home with when you finish selling. And we talked about, I think we talked about post-harvest losses, which was what I just finished hammering on. I said, if you're a farmer, make sure that you have your market close to you if you're farming tomatoes, because if your market is far, you are creating the possibility for logistics problem. The car on transit can break down. When your market is close, when your market is local, the distance to transport your goods is short, so the likelihood of losing would be low. Then also talked about when it comes to post-harvest losses, I talked about having your market already before you even start producing. When producing tomatoes, you have to produce smartly. You have to figure out everything before you start. From the things I've listed, you have to have all these things figured out before you go into production. And I think I talked about something about soil challenges, right? So I talked about how when you're producing tomatoes, you don't produce tomatoes rigorously for very, very long. What I mean is, you don't produce tomatoes for like 3 years stretch or like 4 years stretch. When you do that, you can encounter problems with the soil. So when you're producing your tomatoes, you have to ensure that you rotate with other crops. And after 2 years of planting tomatoes, you switch to another crop, maybe take tomatoes somewhere else, so that you don't have problem of nematodes, soil-borne diseases, and even nutrient depletion, right? So you have to rotate your production when it comes to tomatoes. So these are the few things that are the problems that you would encounter when producing tomatoes. So overall, I would say this: if you cannot manage the risk of producing tomatoes, please produce something else. If you cannot meet up with the demands that comes up with producing tomatoes, please produce something else, right? Especially when you are just starting farming. If you just got into agriculture, tomato is not one of the things you should jump into. Tomato requires investment. Tomato requires expertise. It requires understanding, thorough, not just understanding the market, thorough understanding of the market. So if you produce other things, these other requirements you'll be able to gain it. For instance, you'll be able to understand market. Because when you are selling something like okra, you can be asking questions. Okay, so what's tomato selling now? How do people buy? How do people, get your products? Ask those questions. But you are selling okra. Okra doesn't have the same wala that tomato has, right? And then over time, when you've gotten enough information, then you can now go into it. So if you cannot manage the risk involved in tomatoes, don't go into it. You are very likely to lose money. So, and I don't want that for anybody following me or anybody that goes through my stuff. So that's why we're saying all this, so that you have information. So this is all we'll talk about today on tomatoes. That's a problem farmers face, problem generally faced when tomatoes is produced. We believe that over time, that things will get better in the agricultural sector, especially as young people are getting into it, because we'll get wiser, we'll get smarter, and we'll produce better. So thank you so much for your time. Enjoy your weekend. If you have any question, you can drop it in the comment section and I would answer you. Thank you.